Hello everyone. Welcome to the session on how to identify a perfect seam. In this session, we will learn how to recognize and identify the standards for quality clothing construction that gives a garment a professional and finished look. The workmanship of a garment and each of its components determine the quality of seams. When the seams work is not done properly, it would affect both the external appearance, the comfort of the wearer, and also the garment's durability. Sometimes a garment may look very attractive and appealing, but its quality can be poor. And the problems can be in the seams, which are not visible from the outside. The quality of the fabric and the design of the garment will no doubt determine the look of a garment. However, it is the workmanship in doing the seams that will decide whether the garment would retain its shape and feel comfortable to wear. Garment construction involves not only the joining of the fabric pieces but also attaching trims. So good workmanship is required in the sewing of both to create a quality garment. Seam details and finishes must enhance both the appearance and quality of the garment. The quality of sewing plays a major role in the quality of seams. There are a variety of stitches and sewing techniques that can be used. We must always apply the common standards to all sewing. For example, all construction techniques must produce an inconspicuous, functional, and durable finish and detail. There are some principles of seam construction that we have to keep in mind. First is to use the right thread. You have to match the color, fiber content, thickness, and strength of the thread with the requirements of the seam. You also need to select the right needle type and size which is required for the fabric and stitch used in the seam. Also select the right stitch length which is suitable for the fabric, location, as well as functional and decorative requirements. Also check and adjust the stitch tension and presser foot pressure. You need to test the seam before actually making and finishing the seam. Use 2 strips of the same fabric to test the seam and finish. Make a few back tacking stitch at the beginning and ending of each seam to reinforce the seam. Ironing of seam is also necessary after sewing. Every seam should be flat, neat, and as narrow as possible. One of the most important steps in making of a perfect seam is to set up the sewing machine properly with all the required settings. Let us now look at the various settings and also learn how to check and adjust these settings for making a perfect seam. Specifically, we would look into the following settings in detail: the stitch length, adjusting the tension, choosing the presser foot, and the seam type. Let's discuss stitch length. As we've already learned, stitch length refers to the distance between the starting point and ending point of each stitch. It should not be confused with seam length. What happens when we change the stitch length settings on the sewing machine? It adjusts the distance to which the feed dog will pull the fabric during each stitch. So when we select a shorter stitch length, fabric is pulled forward only for a short distance. On the other hand, when we set a longer stitch length, the fabric is pulled forward for a longer distance. So the stitch length settings on most modern sewing machines range from 0 to 5. It can go up to 7 as well. So each unit in the stitch length settings indicates the length of a single stitch in millimeters. So for example, a stitch length setting of 3 will produce stitches that are 3 mm long, or just under 1/8 of an inch. So there are a number of factors that influence the choice of stitch length. First is the functional convenience. See, while basting, we normally use longer stitch length as it is quicker and at the same time serves the purpose of holding the fabric pieces in place, and it can also be removed easily with speed. Another factor is to prevent fabric damage. A longer stitch length is preferred for sewing leather or vinyl. A longer stitch length reduces the number of holes which are punched into the fabric. So it prevents the stitched edges from tearing off. The next factor is that of outward appearance. For example, in the case of top stitching, for example, we use a longer stitch length as it results in a more neat and professional look. Then speed also is an important factor. It is also true that the ready-made garment industry also uses longer stitch lengths to reduce the stitching time. It needs to be done optimally so that the seam quality does not suffer. Seam neatness is also another factor. In the case of lightweight and sheer fabrics, we use a shorter stitch length to prevent the fabric from getting pulled or gathered during the process of seam construction. Then fabric weight. Longer stitch length is better for heavier weight fabrics to keep the seam flat. Seam strength is also another important factor. So generally, shorter stitch length produces a stronger seam. However, care should be taken to ensure that shorter stitch length does not shred the fabric. The thread size should also be taken into consideration. Longer stitch length is a practical requirement for thicker threads to minimize the bulk and to reduce the stitching problems, whereas shorter stitch lengths are ideal for fine threads for improving the strength and appearance of the seams. Then seam type and location should also be considered. A longer stitch will create angular shapes in curved seams, whereas a shorter stitch length is better for smooth curves. So how do we adjust stitch length? If you have a mechanical sewing machine, that is, which is non-computerized, there is typically a dial on the front of the sewing machine with either length written next to it or a dashed line going from short dashes to longer dashes. So what stitch length should you use? So there are some guidelines for the best stitch length to use in different situations. So a standard stitch length is 2 to 3 mm. So you can fix the dial at 2 or 2.5 or 3. For doing machine basting or gathering, the stitch length should be 5 mm. For doing stay stitching around necklines and curved seams, 1.5 to 2 mm of stitch length is suitable. And for doing top stitching, 3 to 4 millimeters of stitch length is considered suitable. So these are guidelines only. You should always test your stitch on a scrap of fabric and adjust to the fabric and thread on your own preference. The next step is to set the tension setting on the sewing machine. Poor sewing machine tension on a machine can result in an unstable seam, puckering, or just plain unattractive stitching. Perfect machine stitches interlock smoothly and look the same on both sides of the fabric. So if you see small loops on the right side or the wrong side, that means the thread tension is not correct. So how do you adjust the upper thread tension? So when you're adjusting the upper thread tension on your machine, remember that higher numbers on the dial indicate higher tension. That means tighter tension. And lower number indicate lower tension. That means thread is kept loose. So you try changing the tension dial up or down 1 unit and you sew another line of stitching on your sample to see if the tension is balanced. So you continue to change the tension settings until the stitches are balanced and no loops are visible on the top side. So you run your fingers over the stitches on both sides of the fabric. They should feel smooth. So how to know that if your sewing machine tension is too high? So if the tension is too tight, then the fabric can pucker and the bobbin thread may be visible on the top side of the fabric. And if the tension is too loose, you will see visible loops on the top side of the fabric and the spool thread might be visible on the underside. The tension regulator is used to adjust the upper thread tension, while the bobbin thread tension is adjusted with the help of the tension screw on the bobbin tees. So you need to rotate it clockwise to the right to increase the bobbin thread tension and anti-clockwise to the left to reduce the tension. So next comes the choice of presser foot. So there are several varieties of presser foot available, such as for sewing zippers to the garment opening, for making buttonholes, or for holding buttons and snaps in place. So let's discuss some common varieties of presser foot attachments. So there is an all-purpose presser foot. So the all-purpose sewing presser foot can be used for any type of sewing. It is most often used in straight single needle machine, and this is the most basic of sewing presser foot. Then there is blind stitch hem foot. This kind of a presser foot allows for sewing a hem on the wrong side of the garment where the stitches are not visible on the right side, and you can see this blind stitch hemming being done on many of the t-shirts. You can see this blind stitch, and it is done by using a specialized blind stitch presser foot. There is a zipper presser foot also, which is one of the most commonly used presser foot, and it has only one narrow foot which allows for close stitching around the zipper as well as to stitch around the pipings. There is another specialized presser foot for making gathers, which is also called a shirring presser foot. It helps to hold the gathered folds evenly as it passes along the fabric edge. Then there is a button stitch presser foot. Now this presser foot is used to attach the buttons. Both 2-hole or 4-hole buttons can be attached by using this kind of a presser foot. It holds the button securely in place while a zigzag stitch is used to attach the button. So depending on the purpose of the task, the zipper foot is selected, and alongside you also need to adjust the stitch type, tension, stitch length and stitch width. You need to adjust all these settings also in the sewing machine. So after setting the sewing machine, run it on the fabric to check the quality of the seam. The selection of seam and seam finish is the next decision in achieving a perfect seam. One must know about the categories of seam types. So very simply put, they can be, categorized in three types of seam categories: the plain seam, the self-finished seams, and the decorative seams. A plain seam is the simplest type of seam, and it can be used on almost any item. Plain seam is defined as any seam that attaches two pieces of fabric together with the wrong sides facing. When finished, the right side of a plain seam should look smooth without puckers or ripples and should look as flat and inconspicuous as possible. So, imprints or ridges from the seam allowance should not be visible from the right side. The raw edges of plain seam visible from the inside of the garment have to be finished using appropriate finishing methods. Pinking, turning and stitching, overlocking are some of the common ways of finishing a plain seam. Now, the second category of seams is the self-enclosed seams, in which the seam allowances are contained within the finished seams. So, no separate seam finishing is required. The raw edges of the fabric are completely enclosed inside the seam. Examples of self-enclosed seams include French seam, run and fell seam. These seams are specially used for fabrics which fray. There are synthetic fabrics from which threads keep coming out. So these are the fabrics where, you need to use self-enclosed seams. Or even in the case of sheer fabrics or transparent fabrics, where the seams are visible through the fabric. So for those type of fabrics and garments, where a narrow, flat and neat seams are preferred, for example, children's clothing, these self-enclosed seams are used. The third category of seams are decorative seams, which are used for decorative purpose. So these include top stitching, slot seam. So these are examples of decorative seams. Now, the type of seam which is to be used on a garment will depend on various factors, such as first is fabric. So when you're working with a heavy fabric, you should avoid using bulky seams like French seam. So, French seams would be more suitable for delicate fabrics like georgette and chiffon. Then also design and use of the garment also, influences the choice of seam. So, for example, when you're making a sports shirt, a strong seam is required. So, a flat fell seam, a run and fell seam is more appropriate for that purpose. Then another factor is shape of the seam. That also influences the choice of seam. Seams may be straight or curved. So straight seams may be in vertical direction or horizontal direction or slanting and angular direction. So when you're joining curved edges, a plain seam will give a better finish than a French seam. Then location of the seam in the garment also influences the choice of the seam. So there are seams in the areas of the garment which may get stretched during body movement, will have to be made more durable than others. So French seam is ideal for making the side seam, but may not be, more suitable for attaching a sleeve to the armhole. So let's now discuss some of the workmanship standards of seams and seam finishes. So a well-constructed seam should be smooth and even in appearance on the inside and outside of garment. The machine tension, stitch length, presser foot pressure should be properly adjusted to suit the fabric and the thread. A seam should be even and uniform in width throughout its length. A seam should be secure from both at the beginning and at the end. A seam should be pressed open without any puckers or any unsightly appearance, and they should be pressed properly according to the type of seam it is and the way it is used in garment construction. A well-constructed seam would be stitched with the thread which is appropriate to the fabric, type, the color. The thread color should match or should be slightly darker than the fabric. A well-constructed seam should have a consistent stitch length. It would be flat and trimmed or graded if necessary to reduce the bulk. And the seams should be made in such a way that the fabric designs such as stripes or checks should match at the seams as much as possible. Similarly, a well-applied seam finish would be appropriate to the type and weight of the fabric, would be smooth and neat in appearance inside and out, will not create excess bulk on the seam, and a well-constructed seam finish would also be not visible from the right side of the garment. It should be even in width throughout, and it should use understitching to roll under an enclosed seam and should not be visible on the right side. So especially when we are attaching facing on the neckline or any, garment edge, a facing is supposed to go, turn totally inside the garment. So when you are attaching facing to any edge, you must do understitching so that it rolls over, it turns over completely inside the edge. Well-constructed seams would also use reinforcement stitches on the areas of stress. Let's discuss the standards for a well-made machine stitch. So a very well-made machine stitch will use a thread type and needle size which is appropriate to the fabric and situation for which it is used. So generally, finer the fabric, the finer would be the needle and thread, because thread expands and takes up the entire area created by the needle. So there should be no excessive holes created by the needle. Then a well-constructed machine stitch would be controlled, it will have a consistent length which is appropriate to the fabric and situation for which it is used. So as a general rule, the heavier the fabric, the longer would be the stitch. The lightweight the fabric is, the shorter would be the stitch length. So within this rule, adjustments are also made according to the fabric texture and structure. So another standard of a well-made machine stitch is that it would have equally balanced top and bottom threads that should look the same on both sides of the fabric through the use of appropriate thread tension. So the type of stitching which is used, regular machine, sewing machine or overcast machine, or the stitch pattern should be appropriate to the fabric and the situation for which it is used. The seam should be placed at an appropriate distance from the edge of the fabric. It should be neat, straight, and it should fit the purpose for which it was done. That means it should be either functional or decorative or both. So in garment construction, basically, you require function, structure, and decorative design. So clothing, which is a wearable art, it needs to be wearable, which means that it needs to fit the body. It should be able to be taken off and worn again. So the garment needs to feel comfortable. It needs to provide adequate room to move while still maintaining its shape or form. Therefore, the selected fabric needs to be of a suitable weight and appropriate for the garment. This structural design, the structure of a garment is everything, that holds the garment together. The fabric, the seams, shaping, and everything that goes on between the outer fabric and the inside. So it incorporates a number of different elements depending on the desired look that you want to achieve. A garment which has been nicely made and neatly finished will wear better over time. It will also sit better on the body. Sometimes when a garment is not finished, correctly, small details will not seem to hang nicely on a body. Like, for example, a neckline, it may not sit quite well. Seam may pucker up in the wrong areas. So a large part of the ability to control the shape of the garment is in giving the correct structure to the garment. So then decorative design, is also important. So after the functional and structural details have been carefully considered, decorative design is taken care of. Decorative design refers to the decorative surface finish or details, which often, catches your eye first and draws your attention to a garment. So details such as buttons or ribbon or embroidery or trimmings or the fabric print, pattern, color. So these embellishments can be paired or matched to enhance a design. So the purpose may be completely decorative, but it should always be carefully chosen. So basically, the more you sew, the easier it will become. So practice sewing on paper if you have to, and then practice using your sewing machine to sew on fabric. And soon you will realize that you don't even have to think about it, and you will get perfect seams every time or most of the time. Thank you.